Hello and welcome to another podcast from Science on the Edge. I'm Dr. Mark Darcy, and today we're going to delve into the world of nutrition and diet. We'll start at the basics and then we'll get into a little bit more detail. There's a lot of fallacies out there regarding what's good for you, what's bad for you, how much carbohydrate you need, how much fat you need. For example, there's a big fallacy out there that fat is bad. Fat, I can assure you, is not bad. Fat is in fact essential as part of our diet. We need it to build up our cell membranes. We need it to make certain hormones, such as the steroid hormones. They're basically made of cholesterol. And we need fat for all sorts of other reasons. Fat isn't actually our enemy. Carbohydrate, as we'll find out through the course of this particular podcast, has got a lot more of a bad side to it, I would say, a dark side, than fat, although we need carbohydrates too. Okay, so the way we're going to start is we're going to start by just kind of going through a few of the advantages of having good nutrition. I should say right from the offset that most people do not have good nutrition. In the West particularly, diets, standard diets, tend to be deficient in various vitamins, various minerals. The majority of the population will be deficient in something, whether it's vitamin D, whether it's calcium, whether it's magnesium, whether it's one of the B vitamins, iron, whatever. There will be some deficiency in most people's diets. And that has consequences. You may think, okay, my diet isn't particularly great, but I feel perfectly healthy, so there's not really a problem. Well, there might not be a problem as such that you're aware of, but perhaps those headaches that you're prone to boil down to a lack of a certain vitamin or a certain mineral, perhaps iron, perhaps B vitamins. Perhaps the fact that you feel weak all the time, or you get sleepy a little bit easier than perhaps other people do. Maybe your memory's not so great. Maybe your concentration isn't what it should be. Perhaps you don't heal from wounds so quickly. Whenever you get a bug, a cold, influenza, whatever, it takes you just a little longer than you think it should to recover. Well, that might just be your genetics, or it might be that you're deficient in some vitamin, some mineral, and one consequence of that is your poor health or your less than optimal health. But we will get to that. Okay, so first of all, what advantages actually gain from eating well? Well, I've mentioned health, better health. You from eating well, you get a stronger immune system, so you're ill less often. You can perhaps learn more effectively. Your muscle tone, your strength may improve. And you may become more productive just by improving your diet, or perhaps having an optimal diet. Okay, so in terms of what we need in a good diet, we need quite a few things. We need carbohydrates. We need some carbohydrates. You can't get by with no carbohydrates at all. You need proteins. We are basically made of protein. Most of what is in our body is really protein. We have enzymes that aid with digestion, that produce a hair, a skin. These enzymes are made of protein. We also, our skin itself consists of such things as collagen. Collagen is a protein. The keratin of our hair, that is a protein. We are basically made of protein. Our muscles are protein. So we need proteins in our diet. We need fats. As I mentioned earlier, the cell membranes are made of fats. Certain hormones are made of fats. We do need fats. We need vitamins and we need minerals. Vitamins and minerals, we don't need vitamins, for example, in huge amounts, just relatively small amounts, but they're essential. Vitamins help certain enzymes to perform their functions better. In fact, some enzymes cannot perform their functions correctly without the aid of vitamins. So you need vitamins for your metabolism to work correctly, your respiration to work correctly, for you to heal wounds, grow, develop, etc. You need vitamins. We've all heard that during pregnancy, a woman needs the right amount of folic acid, for example. That's essential. If you're deficient in it, you can have all sorts of growth defects. You need minerals. You need things like calcium. Bones cannot grow without calcium. You need water, obviously. I know it sounds like an obvious thing, water, but many people don't get enough. They become either dehydrated, and dehydration, to be honest, can actually cause issues with the kidneys. It can cause issues with blood pressure. Dehydration is something you should really avoid at all costs. So we do need water. Basically, the chemical reactions in our body take place in a medium of water. So we do need water. And we need fiber. So what do we need fiber for? You may think fiber is just something that we need to bulk out food. Yes, it does bulk out food. Fiber, however, helps with digestive transit. It gives the guts something to hold on to as the food is moved through our body from entry point, the mouth, right through to exit point, the anus. So we need fiber to help digestive transit. Without the right amount of fiber, you can suffer from constipation, you can have bowel problems. There have been all sorts of studies linking insufficient amounts of fiber with the development of bowel cancer, with colitis and all sorts of inflammatory diseases of the gut. Now, it's not just down, and I'll dwell on fiber for a second actually, it's not just down to the fiber helping you to move foodstuffs through the body. It's more complicated than that. Fiber is fed upon by bacteria within our gut. Now, we've all heard the idea of good bacteria and bad bacteria. Good bacteria exists, bad bacteria exists, and our guts contain hundreds of different strains of bacteria. We all have a unique biome, let's say, of different strains of bacteria living and prospering in our guts. But to live and prosper, these bacteria need to eat, and they eat pretty much what we eat. So we eat food, the food goes into our gut, the bacteria then feed on that food. Now, if you eat a lot of protein, a lot of fats, you're going to help to develop a population of bacteria in your gut that likes protein and fat. Same with carbohydrates. If, however, you eat a lot of fiber, you're going to help a community of bacteria that like fiber to prosper. And the bacteria that like fiber are what we can generally, at least, call the good bacteria. These fiber-eating bacteria, they eat the fiber, which does us good in more than one way. First of all, as they eat the fiber, they release certain nutrients from the fiber, from the vegetables and the fruit, that we cannot digest ourselves, that we don't have the enzymes to get at. Those bacteria do have the enzymes, however, so they can release certain key nutrients from vegetable matter that we just can't get access to ourselves. And once they've released this key material, it can be digested, enter our bloodstream, and we can use it. So we need this bacteria to get at certain essential nutrients. But also, a byproduct of this good bacteria is that they tend to release what we call anti-inflammatory compounds. Now, inflammation is bad. So many diseases are caused by inflammation. Everything from Alzheimer's to irritable bowel syndrome to cancers to arthritis are all linked with inflammation. Even things such as autism have been linked in certain studies with inflammation. So inflammation generally is bad. It wears out the body, it speeds up aging, etc. Now, these good bacteria are releasing compounds which help to prevent inflammation. They block inflammation. These compounds get into your bloodstream, bring down inflammation, and this improves health. So we need to feed the good bacteria. And to feed the good bacteria, we need fiber. So eat your greens. And not just one type of green, I should say. Different strains of bacteria like different types of vegetables. A varied diet is always good. Okay, so we're going to go through some definitions at this point. I think we'll define the term balanced diet. We'll explain how consumption of an unbalanced diet can lead to malnutrition. And we will refer to such things as obesity, which is a big thing in the West, quite literally. Obesity has really become such a big killer in the West particularly, but not just in the West. In the Middle East, obesity has now become a massive problem, and in pretty much every developed and developing country. In fact, we've reached a point now in the 21st century where more people actually die from too much food than from starvation. I know that might be something that you listen to and think, oh, wait a minute, I see all of these news items about famines around the world and starvation. The world is starving, we don't have enough food. Well, certain parts of the world are still starving, and certain parts of the world have a deficiency in food, but actually we have now reached a point where hunger is much less of a problem than it has been in previous centuries. Well, in all previous centuries. More people now do die from obesity on this planet, from overindulgence, than from starvation. But we will get to that. Okay, so why do organisms need energy? Well, to grow, to move, to reproduce, to keep warm. We need energy for all of these things. There's such a thing as an energy budget. It basically is the amount of energy taken in by an organism and the amount of energy used up. This is a very simple calculation. If you think about it, if you take in more energy than you burn, you're going to put on weight. If you burn more energy than you take in, then you're going to lose weight. That sounds obvious, doesn't it? Basic thermodynamics. Actually, it is more complicated than that, a lot more complicated than that. In previous decades, this energy budget was everything. Doctors, cardiologists, all of these people, if a patient came to them and said, with a problem of being overweight, then the doctor would say, you're eating too much. You need to eat less. If you eat less, then you will lose weight. Basic thermodynamics. But no, that is too simplistic. Basically, it's not about how much you eat necessarily, although if you eat enough, if you eat way too much, you are going to put weight on, but it's more about what you eat. Certain foods basically stimulate certain hormones in your body, and other foods inhibit them. And a lot of your size, your shape, your muscle mass, your fat levels are down to which hormones are active in your body. For example, you have an excess of certain hormones if you're female and you suffer from polycystic ovaries, and that can lead to obesity. Women generally are a different shape than men, and that is obvious. Take a man and take a woman and they're eating the same diet, they are a different shape, they have different amounts of fat on the body, and in different places, which should tell you straight away that it's not just about the fat itself, it's about the hormones that your body are making. Sort of illustrate that fact, think about children. Think about a boy and a girl. Until puberty, they more or less look the same. Yes, they're dressed differently, but physically they're more or less the same. They're about the same height, they're about the same build, they have about the same muscle mass, fat levels, etc. And then puberty hits. And when puberty hits, the hormones change. The male starts producing lots of testosterone and various androgens. The female starts producing hormones such as estrogen. And then the body shapes change in both the boy and the girl. The woman will develop breasts, the hips will tend to get larger, more fat on the thighs, etc., etc. Whereas the male will develop thicker muscles, and fat distribution will be different. So this shows you straight away that it's not just about the energy budget, it's about how much, it's about the hormones. It's about the hormones. And we all have different levels of certain hormones. By the way, don't start thinking, oh damn, there's nothing I can do about it, it's just my hormones. Maybe you're overweight and you're thinking, haha, now I have an excuse. It's my hormones. Well, it might be your hormones. Maybe you have a slow metabolism. Maybe you have polycystic ovaries. Maybe you have an imbalance of thyroid hormone, whatever it is. but that's unlikely. Most people don't. When I'm talking about hormones here, I'm talking about certain foods that we eat can stimulate certain hormones, and being aware of that can actually help you to lose weight if that's your aim. But again, we will get to that. Okay, so the consequences of an energy imbalance, taking in more calories or the wrong kind of calories than you expend, results in weight increase. Taking in fewer calories or the better type of calories, let's just say, than expend results in weight loss. So what is a balanced diet? A balanced diet is basically a bit of everything. We are omnivores. Humans are omnivores. We evolved in Africa, and for the 200,000 years that we've been around, more or less, almost 200,000 years, until we got to the point where we started farming, when we were still hunter-gatherers. So most of our history we have been hunter-gatherers. And being hunter-gatherers, we ate a bit of everything. One day you would be eating rabbits, the next you would be eating wildebeest, and the next you would be eating berries, nuts, tubers, honey, fruit, whatever. And our bodies have evolved to expect that. We expect a balanced diet. The bacteria in our gut expects a balanced diet. So we should eat fruit and vegetables. We should eat, unless of course you're a vegetarian, meat, fish, eggs. We should eat beans. We should have a lot of fiber in our diet, coming from the fruits and vegetables. We should have fat and sugar in our diet of a certain amount. Actually, not refined sugar, that's not so good. Fat, again, it depends on the type of fat. Good fats, bad fats, LDLs, HDLs, omega-3, etc., etc. We're going to get to that. Perhaps milk and dairy foods, although a lot of people are lactose intolerant, especially people that aren't of a Northern European background. Many people of an African descent or Asian, Far Eastern, that is, descent, can be lactose intolerant. So dairy produce, depends. Okay, so in terms of a balanced diet, we need carbohydrate. Although there's more studies showing that we don't need much of it. It provides an energy source, but fat provides an energy source too, I should say. Protein for growth, tissue repair, making our enzymes. We need fats to store energy, provide insulation, make up cell membranes and protect our organs. But again, the type of fat, very important. We need vitamins. So they have different functions. All the different vitamins have different functions. Oh, by the way, for any Americans that are out there that are listening to this particular podcast, that are probably giggling at me using the word vitamin rather than vitamin, the term was invented by an English guy. So I am going to take, I'm going to actually take that as ours and say yes, the pronunciation is vitamin. But feel free to continue using vitamin. Okay, but we need vitamins for different reasons. So, for example, vitamin K for blood clotting, vitamin C for our immune system, vitamin D for our bones, etc. We need mineral salts, different functions again, e.g. calcium for bone formation. We need fiber to aid movement of food through the gut, and for all those other good reasons that I told you about earlier. And we need water used in chemical reactions. We need to constantly replace water lost through breathing, urinating, and sweating. So the macronutrients are basically the carbohydrates, the fats and oils, and the protein. So carbohydrate, for example, consists of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Used in the body as a source of energy. You can get it from rice, potatoes, and bread. Fats and oils also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Used as a source of energy and for insulation, can be found in butter, milk, cheese, and egg yolk. Proteins, again, consisting of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but also nitrogen in this case. We need for growth and tissue repair, found in meat, fish, eggs, soya, and milk. So requirements of a balanced diet, we need sufficient energy for our needs. We need a certain essential amino acids. I should say what an essential amino acid is. Certain amino acids we can kind of manufacture ourselves in our body. Other ones we cannot. And the ones we cannot manufacture ourselves, we need to get from our diet. So we need the right proteins. Proteins are made of amino acids. We need the right proteins to get the right amino acids. We need essential fatty acids. We also need micronutrients. I've mentioned the macronutrients, the big things, the fats, the carbohydrates, and the proteins. But we also need micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. We need water and we need fiber. In terms of guidelines for how much you need, I mean, I can give you some figures, but the figures vary massively. So, for example, guidelines for a 17-year-old girl. Again, straight away, you're probably thinking, which 17-year-old girl? The 4'9" skinny 17-year-old girl, or the 6'1" stocky 17-year-old girl? Well, the average 17-year-old girl. But then, what's average? Average Westerner, average Asian, average African. Let's just say average to start with. I'll give you some numbers and then we'll break it down. So, average Western 17-year-old girl. In terms of carbohydrates, you need about 250 grams per day, depending on the body mass. Fats about 80, protein 60, minerals 9.2, fiber 12, vitamins, traces of vitamins, just small amounts. Water levels, they do vary. But these numbers, pay them no heed. These numbers are very, very general. Really, it's not the same for everyone. The sort of factors that influence how much energy you need, for example, so how much carbohydrate, how much fat you need for energy, the sort of things that will influence that would be how active you are. So imagine an adult that works in a farm, is walking around all the time on their feet, lifting things, moving things, etc., etc. I obviously don't know a lot about farming, but I imagine there's a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of moving around. Or a builder, a bricklayer, they do move around, I see them. They're going to need a lot of energy. They're going to need a lot more than an office worker, someone who sits at a desk all day and spends their day tapping a keyboard and clicking a mouse. Also, men and women need different amounts of energy. Also, children and adults. Children are growing. To grow, you need energy. They are constantly active. Their brain is developing. Their body is developing. You need energy to feed all of that. Adults need their amount of energy. Old people. Old people don't need the same amount of food as young people. They really don't. There's a saying which goes something along the lines of eat your age. And very few people follow that particular saying. When you're a child, you need a certain amount of food to grow and develop. You're very active. This goes right through into your 20s. And then you still need a lot of energy. You still need a lot of energy. You're young, you're active, you're physical. So you need energy. But as you start to get a bit older, your metabolism starts to slow down. As it slows down, it requires less energy. A 60-year-old should not be eating the same as a 30-year-old. Because a 60-year-old on that same diet is likely to put on weight. So is a 50-year-old for that matter. There are many reasons why people tend to get out of shape as they get older. They tend to put on more body fat, become more podgy. Many of these reasons have nothing to do with diet. It's just about hormones and all the rest of it. But your metabolism is slower as you get older, on average. And if you keep eating at 40 what you ate at 20, you're likely to put on weight. For any of the 40-year-olds out there, you've probably already started noticing, either yourself or friends around you, getting out of shape. And yes, diet is doing that. As you get older, you need to rethink what you eat. Happened to me in my 20s, to be honest. I used to be able to eat whatever I wanted. When I was an undergraduate, I lived on curries and kebabs. And then, after I graduated, got into my mid-20s or so, I was still eating the same food, and over a period of a year or two, I put on a lot of weight. A lot of weight. I started to get a belly on me, a big belly on me. Well, I say big. Much bigger than it was. I was a 30-inch waist, 28, 30-inch waist. At 22, at 25, I'd gone up to a 38. on the same diet. And then a friend of mine, in a very unsubtle way, involving lots of laughter. This friend I'd not seen for a couple of years, so she'd seen me jump from being thin to not being thin. She saw me, pointed at my stomach, burst out laughing and said, "What the expletive is that?" At which point I realised I needed to do something. I changed my diet, the fat fell off. I'm in good shape now. The point is, eat your age. Remember that as you get older. Don't have the same portion as a 20-year-old when you're 50 unless you're incredibly active. Okay, so malnutrition. What is malnutrition? Malnutrition is basically an unbalanced diet. Not getting the right amount of nutrients. This could mean eating too much or not eating enough. Either way is malnutrition. So malnutrition is just not getting the right diet. Too much of something, not enough of something. Malnutrition can be the consequence. So getting too little of a nutrient can lead to deficiency illnesses. For example, too little iron in the diet can cause anemia. Getting too many carbohydrates or fats, or a combination of the two, the combination is crucial actually, I will get to that, can lead to obesity. Not being able to absorb nutrients into the bloodstream, e.g. celiac diseases, so gluten intolerance, that kind of thing. Reduces nutrient absorption from small intestine. This can cause a deficiency illness. So some people just don't get enough nutrients because they're not absorbing them. They may be eating them, but they're not being absorbed. This is quite common. Actually, getting back to the gut, I mentioned earlier on that not getting the right amount of fiber in your diet can lead to, well, inflammation of the gut because you don't have those anti-inflammatory bacteria present in large numbers in your gut. So inflammation can happen. And many of us have inflammation of our gut, whether it's something severe like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, or whether it's something milder like IBS, or milder still, maybe you're someone that tends to get a slightly irritated gut quite often. Certain things make your stomach upset. Well, that could be inflammation, a mild amount of inflammation. Maybe perhaps due to some allergic reaction or intolerance to something in your diet. And if you have an inflamed gut, then that means certain nutrients might not be able to pass into your bloodstream properly. They might not be able to absorb properly, in which case you can become deficient. I knew a guy with a condition called ulcerative colitis. Very tall guy, I think 6'2", 6'3". But he weighed hardly anything. He was extremely skinny. Because he had ulcerative colitis, his guts, his bowels were inflamed. He just wasn't absorbing nutrients. So that can be a real problem. But even if you've got mild inflammation, that can be a problem. And mild inflammation of the gut can be ameliorated in many cases just by eating fiber, getting those good bacteria to grow properly and release those anti-inflammatory compounds to bring down inflammation. Okay, so eating too little. A person who does not eat enough can lack energy, show signs of protein energy malnutrition, and they could have certain deficiencies that impair their health, such as, for example, if you have low vitamin D, rickets can develop, abnormal bone formation. Not much of a problem in the West anymore, but even so, low vitamin D levels can have all sorts of effects on the metabolism and the general health of the body and the brain. So you need enough vitamin D. And I should say, if you're someone that doesn't get outdoors a lot, or you're someone from parts of the world where we just don't get much sun, like me, England, then vitamin D deficiency is a real worry. If you don't get enough sun and you've not got a diet rich in vitamin D, you can become deficient in vitamin D. Also, if you're someone with darker skin, if you're of African descent, Middle Eastern descent, anyone with dark skin, really, mixed race people, for example, then perhaps that pigment in your skin is blocking a lot of the UV light that you're exposed to, especially in colder climates, which might mean that you are also deficient in vitamin D. Check on that. It's very common, vitamin D deficiency, and has all sorts of negative effects on the health. Lack of vitamin C. That basically is bad for the immune system, amongst other things. I could tell a little story about that, actually. I will tell a little story about that, just to break up the current flow slightly, liven it up. So the British Navy and the French Navy and the various other navies back in the imperial days, 17th, 18th century, they were fighting each other everywhere, trying to take over the world, and succeeded to a great extent. Not that I'm promoting empire building, by the way. Now, when the dust all settled, it seemed to be the British Empire that seemed to eventually rule the waves, as it was. The British Empire seemed to win at empire, so to speak. And the historians will tell you it's because of this general or that general or this admiral or that admiral. And yes, that's obviously all partly true. But the humble lime has a lot to play in the victory also. How? Well, I will clarify that now. Basically, when the empires were being built, there were a lot of huge navies. These navies were powered by sail. These sailing ships, these warships went around the world. They spent months and months at a time at sea. And the sailors on board were basically living on dried biscuits, dried meats, that kind of thing. They were not getting their fruit and fibre. No vegetables, no fruit. At the time, no one knew anything about vitamins. But what they did know is that when these sailors spent large amounts of time out at sea, they started developing a condition called scurvy. Their gums would bleed, they would get headaches, they would be weak, they would vomit, they would basically start to show all the symptoms of quite a nasty illness. Now, that sort of sailor isn't much use to anyone. If you're suffering from scurvy, you're not going to fight well, you're not going to work hard, you're not going to be able to do your job particularly well. Now, this affected the British Navy, the French Navy, the Dutch Navy, all the navies. But then a British guy had an idea. He wondered if perhaps this condition was being caused by the lack of fruit. And he did a test. There was a big voyage planned. The ship was going on a big, long trip across the seas. And he decided to put dried limes onto that ship. These dried limes were to be eaten every day by the sailors while they were away at sea. Something that they didn't take kindly to, by the way. As you can imagine, dried limes, not particularly tasty. But they were made to do it. And on that voyage, nobody got scurvy. Once this information got back to the Admiralty, these limes and other dried fruits were put on all long naval voyages, and scurvy became a thing of the past. This gave the British Navy a huge advantage. There was some big battle between two navies at sea, and one navy had a pile of sailors with scurvy and the other one didn't. You can guess who's going to win. So obviously generals, admirals had a lot to do with these victories, but honestly, vitamin C, which is present in lime, also has a lot of responsibility for those victories. Whether you think the victories are good or not, but that's a different thing. Okay, so an unbalanced diet can lead to obesity. So obesity generally is defined as being 20% or more over recommended body weight. Recommended body weight. Now that's a term that really can be variable. But anyway, that's a standard. 20% or more above the recommended body weight. Eating too much sugary and or fatty food can lead to this. Can be due to an underactive thyroid also. So Hashimoto's disease, for example, a syndrome whereby your thyroid is not producing enough thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, by the way, controls the speed of your metabolism. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, your metabolism slows down, you put on weight, put on fat. So, the consequences of obesity: higher risk of coronary heart disease, of arthritis, of high blood pressure, of diabetes, and of some cancers. All of this can result from obesity. Obesity isn't just something that causes heart disease. I think we all know that obesity can lead to heart disease. But it's not just heart disease. All these other conditions can be caused by obesity. Obesity is just bad. Being overweight is a bad thing. Obviously, being 20% over recommended body weight, though, is such a vague term. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, at his peak, was way more than 20% over his recommended body weight, but that was muscle. Muscle isn't contributing to obesity. Sorry, not obesity. I mean, muscle mass isn't contributing to the heart disease, whereas having too much fat in your body is. Okay, this is why these terms such as BMI are very, very general. Okay, so lots of issues with being obese. So obesity technically is defined as when excessive fat deposition impairs health. A body mass index, BMI, of greater than 30. This is an indication that the body weight is 20% or more above that recommended for your height. You can do the calculation yourself if you want to determine whether you are overweight or not, although most people generally have an idea. So your BMI, your body mass index, equals your mass in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. Height in meters squared. So if you have a body mass index that's less than 18.5, you're considered to be underweight. And underweight, by the way, is as bad as overweight. We always focus on the TV and in the magazines and on the internet, etc., on people being overweight and how bad that is. But being underweight is bad. Those skinny models that used to prance around the catwalks in the 1980s and 90s, they weren't healthy. Size 0 isn't healthy. Being underweight causes all sorts of problems. So if your BMI is less than 18.5, you should worry. And you should perhaps do something about it. 18.5 to 24.9 is what you call an acceptable BMI. So if you're between 18.5 and 24.9, yeah, your weight's probably fine. But again, it depends on muscle mass, etc., etc. If your BMI is 25 to 29.9, you're considered overweight. You should maybe think about doing something about it. Some exercise, watching what you eat, etc. If you have a BMI of 30 to 34.9, you are obese class 1. 35 to 39.9, obese class 2. And if your BMI is greater than 40, then you are morbidly or severely obese. So that's obese class 3. Just don't get to that stage. If you get to that stage, do something about it because you're at severe risk of a very premature death. And if you say, oh, I don't care about that, I enjoy my food, I'm going to die young, I'll accept that as a consequence. Think about how you die in that case. Because it's not necessarily that you'll just have a lovely, happy life of eating lovely food and then one day a massive heart attack and you're dead. It might be that you develop diabetes, that you have a minor heart attack that prevents you from being active anymore, from leaving the house even, that you end up in pain for long periods of your life before you die. So be healthy if you can. Preach over. Okay, well, that particular preach over anyway. So moving on. Health risks associated with obesity. Cancer is one. Cancer is one. People don't tend to think about cancer when they think about obesity, but moving all that bad food through your guts increases the likelihood of certain cancers, such as, for example, cancer of the bowel. Although being obese is associated with lots of other types of cancer as well, from breast cancer to prostate cancer, etc., etc. So you don't want cancer. A number of my family members have died from cancer. It's a horrible way to go. And if you can do something to prevent it, eat well, exercise. Type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is associated strongly with obesity. And it's not a good condition to have. It really is not. Coronary heart disease, I mentioned earlier. Coronary heart disease is a common consequence of obesity. Basically, the coronary arteries, which are the arteries that feed your heart, feed the muscle of your heart with blood, they can become blocked with fat. And if they become blocked with fat, well, you may have a heart attack. And a heart attack loses function within the heart. It causes a loss of function within the heart. Minor heart attack in a small branch of one of the coronary arteries can basically be lived with. You can survive it, but perhaps have a reduced level of functionality. But a major blockage of a coronary artery can result in death or severe debilitation. Not something that you want. Okay, so the prevalence of obesity, well, it's increasing in affluent countries. As money comes to a country, so does fat. People eat more than they need to if they can afford it. Take less exercise. If you're wealthy, then you tend to drive places rather than walk places or take the bus. In the UK, for example, 25% of men are obese, 20% of women are obese. The figures are larger than that in the US. And in certain parts of the Middle East. Obesity is a big problem around the world, and it's an increasing problem. Now, I should, again, have another little segue into a related topic at this point. When it comes to people overeating when food is available, you might wonder why that is. Well, it's evolution as much as anything else. As I mentioned earlier, for 200,000 years, humans have been crawling around this planet. And for most of those 200,000 years, we were hunter-gatherers. Which means we had huge periods of our lives where we just didn't have enough food. If we couldn't find the prey, if there was some drought, if, there was just certain plants are just not coming to fruit that year, then we didn't get enough nutrients. So our bodies are kind of programmed, if we find high calorie foods, to eat them, to overeat them, so that we've got stores in our body for when there is a lack of food again. So we're programmed, if we see high calorie foods, to just eat them. A human wandering around back in the Paleolithic times, if he came across a tree that was in fruit, he would eat as much of that fruit as he possibly could. He would stuff that into him, because he doesn't know when he will ever find another tree that's ripe with fruit. The problem is, in modern societies, we have food everywhere. Every corner there is somewhere you can buy food. Our fridges are full of food. But we still have that program in our genes saying, eat, 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 eat. So we do. And thus become overweight. So really, to not become overweight, we have to kind of go against our nature in a way, or at least fool our nature. One way to fool our nature is to basically bulk up our food, fill our stomachs with lower calorie foods. And that way, we won't be as hungry. But really, there's only so much you can do. The key really is to try not to have high calorie foods if you can avoid it. And if you do have high calorie foods, then have them with something that will bulk out the dish so that you get full that little bit quicker. Also, the time of day that you eat is important. It really is. There's a saying which goes something along the lines of breakfast of a king, lunch of a prince, and supper of a pauper. And it makes sense. When you get up in the morning, your metabolism switches on and it moves fast and you're active. And if you eat your big meal, then it's not going to sit around in your gut. It's not going to sit around in your blood, sticking to arteries, so to speak. It's going to be used up as you move around. But if you have a big meal just before bed, that's not so good. A big meal before bed will sit in your stomach, will sit in your intestine. The fat will sit in your blood all night, which can do harm. So if you're going to have a big meal, it's better to have it early in the day than later in the day. Again, I know easier said than done depending on your job, but really it's a good routine to get into. There have been a number of studies showing that eating your large meal earlier in the day produces a healthier body and a lower level of certain diseases. Okay, so when you eat is important. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about coronary heart disease, and then I'll kind of move on from that. I think coronary heart disease is something I should talk about, though, because it's just such a big killer. It really, really is, and it can be a silent killer. A lot of people don't know they've got it until they have their heart attack or their stroke. There is such a thing as a thin fat person, you know. Someone who's got lots of fat around their organs, in their arteries, but actually doesn't look outwardly fat. Some of these people out there that say, oh, I can eat what I want and I don't put weight on, well, maybe they're not putting visible weight on, but maybe the fat is sticking in their arteries. And maybe that will result in coronary heart disease. So I will talk about coronary heart disease. So a major cause of coronary heart disease is what we could call atherosclerosis, which is a thickening of arteries caused by a build-up of fatty plaques known as atheromas on the inside walls of the arteries. Atherosclerosis can eventually lead to a reduced blood supply known as ischemia. This reduced blood supply to tissues around the body can have potentially fatal consequences. So it's a result of a build-up of as a result of a build-up of the fat due to coronary heart disease, the arteries become narrow, the flow of blood decreases to various tissues, organs in your body, the supply of nutrients and oxygen to heart muscle is restricted, the muscle then does not release enough energy, and the heart becomes weak. So when it comes to these atheromas building up within the arteries, so let me talk about the steps. I think first of all I'll just describe the structure of an artery. An artery is what we call the lumen, which is the space in the middle of the artery that the blood flows through. There is an artery wall. The artery wall has got several layers of tissue, including a layer of muscle. And the build-up of this atheroma is sort of within the tissue lining the artery. So first of all, you get some damage to the wall of the artery. How does the damage occur? Well, the damage can occur for a number of reasons. For example, if you have high blood pressure, due to too much salt in your diet, too much sugar in your diet, smoking, stress, a number of other causes, then this can cause the blood cells that are bouncing around through the blood vessels to damage the wall of the artery. Other things can cause damage to the walls of the artery as well. It's not just smoking and diet, but that's the main things. Okay, so step one, you get damage to the wall of the artery. Part of the lining of the artery becomes damaged. Gradually over time, cells divide in the artery wall, and there's a build-up of lipids, of fats, in the wall of the artery. Exercise or stress can make the plaque break. So this plaque that's building up in the wall of the artery can break, creating a kind of wound in the wall of the artery. Blood then enters this crack. Platelets in the blood, which are involved in clotting, then become activated, and a clot forms in the wall of the artery. Part of a clot then may later break off, and as it breaks off, you can end up with a heart attack because the clot is going to stop somewhere and block some blood vessel. This can cause a heart attack, or even a stroke if the clot comes loose and lodges itself in one of the arteries of the brain. I'm going to go into this in more detail, actually, because that was an overview. I think perhaps I should go into slightly more detail of how this forms. So just so you can picture it. This is obviously a podcast, so there aren't images. So let me make this clear. So the process of atherosclerosis. So the artery itself, you have the lumen in the middle. This is the space in the middle of the artery that the blood flows through. Around that, you have a layer of smooth muscle known as the tunica media. Between the tunica media and the lumen, there is also a thin layer of tissue known as the endothelium, the tunica intima. And then the outer part of the artery is a layer of connective tissue known as the tunica exterior. So lumen in the middle, thin layer known as the endothelium, tunica intima. Around that, smooth muscle, tunica media. And around that, the connective tissue, tunica exterior. Okay, so An artery wall consists of these three layers. The lumen is relatively narrow, which helps maintain high blood pressure. You do need a certain amount of blood pressure in your blood vessels to push that blood around the body. Atherosclerosis develops between the smooth muscle and the endothelial layers. So low density lipoprotein cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, in the blood penetrates the endothelial wall of the artery where it is then oxidized. This causes an inflammatory response, resulting in the arrival of macrophages. Macrophages are basically white blood cells that try and eat anything bad in your body, whether it be bacteria or whether it be damaged tissue and cells. So these macrophages arrive at the endothelial wall. The macrophages move into the artery wall, where they then ingest the LDL cholesterol and turn into large foam cells. These create a fatty streak, the first visible sign of atherosclerosis. So you've got a fatty streak there now in the lining of the artery. Okay, the inflammatory response then continues, and smooth muscle cells in the tunica media migrate into the tunica intima. Here they secrete extracellular matrix molecules such as collagen, leading to the formation of a fibrous cap. So you're getting a lump starting to form now in the wall of the artery. Lipids continue to build up underneath the fibrous cap, and together they form an atheroma, or atherosclerotic plaque. This causes the artery wall to bulge outwards. Deposits of calcium, calcification, can occur in the smooth muscle cells underneath the atheroma, causing the artery to harden and lose its elasticity. This is called atherosclerosis. If the fibrous cap ruptures, which it might do due to high blood pressure or stress, tissue fragments will then move into the lumen, the space in the artery. This triggers the formation of a clot. Bleeding into the atheroma can also occur, causing the atheroma to grow and cause lumen narrowing, so a narrowing of the artery. The clot is reabsorbed. Repeated ruptures cause the fibrous cap to thicken, narrowing the lumen and reducing blood flow. This can lead to angina, or if the blockage is big enough, a heart attack known as a myocardial infarction. You can also have bits of fat just breaking loose and traveling around the body and blocking other arteries and blood vessels. So that's basically atherosclerosis in a nutshell. A nasty thing that you really want to avoid if you possibly can. Okay, so moving on, risk factors. Risk factors for coronary heart disease. Some risk factors are modifiable and some are non-modifiable. So let's go for the modifiable risk factors first, because you've got control over those. High blood pressure. High blood pressure puts you at huge risk of coronary heart disease. It really does. High blood pressure, it's the baddie. High blood pressure is bad. But high blood pressure you can usually control. If you just don't have too much salt in your diet, try to keep stress to a minimum. I know that's easier said than done in many lifestyles, many modern lifestyles. But stress can cause high blood pressure. Salt content you can control. Reduce the amount of salt in your diet. You will reduce blood pressure. High blood cholesterol. If you've got too much cholesterol in your blood, then you can basically, you've got the fats to stick in the artery and start this whole process going. So keeping the amount of cholesterol in your diet low is a good preventative measure. Tobacco smoking. Don't smoke. Honest. It's bad. It really, really is. All of those government campaigns trying to persuade you to stop smoking, they're not lying to you. I know that you may have a granddad who lived to be 90 and he smoked 20 cigarettes a day, but he was lucky, let's face it. Most people that smoke have a negative consequence from it. Smoking kills, and it kills most of the people that do it, or certainly makes their life expectancy much reduced, and gives them various conditions from coronary heart disease, the obvious one, to cancer, to angina, to pretty much everything. Don't smoke. I know it's hard to quit, and I know you might look very cool with that leather jacket and the cigarette, but honestly, it's so bad for you. And it's bad for your kids. It's bad for the people around you. Try and quit. Or even vape. The evidence for vaping is still out there. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be as good as people make out, but you will get your nicotine from vaping, and it certainly doesn't have all the toxic chemicals that normal tobacco does. Physical inactivity, that can cause coronary heart disease. You need to be active to keep that fat that you do absorb moving around your body quickly and being processed quickly. You need to keep your heart strong and your blood vessels wide. To do that, you exercise. Now, obesity, obviously, if you can just keep the weight off, that will lower your chances of coronary heart disease significantly. Lower the amount of sugar in your diet. Sugar, especially sugar with fat, increases your chances of developing diabetes mellitus, type 2 diabetes. Alcohol consumption. There's nothing wrong with the odd beer. In fact, a lot of studies show that small amounts of alcohol are actually good for you. They lower stress. They can basically give you that stop mechanism at the end of a day or the end of a week to just help you cope with life. I'm obviously speaking as someone who does drink. I'm saying that. I'm a bit biased. But drinking to excess is definitely bad for you. It really is. Too much alcohol interferes with your blood pressure, can damage your liver, can cause all sorts of problems, but it can also increase your chances of developing coronary heart disease. So keep the drink to a minimal. Now, these are modifiable risk factors. There are non-modifiable risk factors as well. Advancing age. As you get older, the chances of getting coronary heart disease do increase. There's no way of sugarcoating that. Try and age gracefully. Keep yourself fit, have the right diet, and you'll reduce the likelihood of coronary heart disease. But the fact of the matter is, as you get older, your chances of getting the disease are going to increase on average. Being male. If you can avoid it, try not to be male. That might sound a little bit of a weird thing to say, but obviously you can't avoid your gender, but men are more likely to get coronary heart disease than women. So there we go. Not something we can really control. A family history of a disease. We can't modify our family history, unfortunately, and a lot of what we are is down to our genes. If there's a family history of coronary heart disease, then perhaps you're carrying a few genes or a few alleles of certain genes in your genome that just make you more likely to get the disease. But just because you have certain genes that make you more likely to get the disease doesn't mean you can't avoid it. You can do things to help reduce the risks. So all those things I've said already, reducing cholesterol levels, reducing blood pressure, giving up smoking, being active, they can all help compensate for bad genes, at least to a degree. Ethnicity and race. Certain races and ethnic groups have a high incidence of coronary heart disease. They just do. This may be down to genes. Different races do have different versions of different genes. We just do. But it also may be down to culture in many cases. Again, certain cultures have diets that are higher in sugar, in fat, etc., and that can be partly to blame too. So, hypertension and coronary heart disease. That's a big one, really. Hypertension is basically high blood pressure. And it's a big boy. If you have high blood pressure, you're more likely to get coronary heart disease. So, high blood pressure, known as hypertension, is a major risk factor for coronary heart disease and other cardiovascular diseases for that matter. So, hypertension is usually defined as a systolic blood pressure above 140 millimeters of mercury, and or a diastolic blood pressure of above 90 millimeters of mercury. So 140 over 90. You're hypertensive if you are beyond that level. So pay attention when you get your blood pressure measured, because if your blood pressure is high, then you're more likely to get coronary heart disease and other problems. But just because you're diagnosed with high blood pressure doesn't mean you can't do something about it. You can reduce it. Change your diet, low salt, exercise, etc. And perhaps reduce those stress levels if at all you can. So hypertension, high blood pressure, it puts strain on the heart and the blood vessels, increasing the risk of aneurysm, which is basically the erosion of the wall of a blood vessel and perhaps the rupturing of a blood vessel. It's sometimes called the silent killer hypertension because it can develop without symptoms. You can be walking around feeling perfectly healthy, going to the gym even, blissfully unaware that you're hypertensive. It's only when you go and get your blood pressure tested that you can find this out. And it's worth getting your blood pressure tested, especially, by the way, if you're over 40. If you're over 40, blood pressure tends to get a little bit higher anyway, and you're more at risk of heart disease at that point. But check your blood pressure anyway, even if you're under 40. But if you're over 40, definitely get your blood pressure checked if you haven't already. And if you are hypertensive, do something about it. You might walk away from the doctor's surgery with the news that you have slightly high blood pressure and think, I feel fine. I'm not going to worry about it. Silent killer, remember. Worry about it. Actually, don't worry too much because stress can cause high blood pressure too. Just do something about it, if at all you can. Okay, right, so hypertension and coronary heart disease. So the most common causes of hypertension are physical inactivity, excessive salt intake, obesity, stress, smoking, and high alcohol consumption. It also increases with age, but there are things you can do about it. So now let's talk a little bit about lipoproteins. What are lipoproteins? Lipoproteins are made in the liver. They basically move cholesterol around the bloodstream. As cholesterol is water soluble, it's coated with phospholipids, type of fat, and proteins so that they can travel in blood plasma. Cholesterol and lipoproteins have a bit of a relationship. So, cholesterol is a soft, waxy lipid that has a vital role as a component of cell membranes where it regulates fluidity. Cholesterol is insoluble in blood, so it's transported by lipoproteins. These are spherical complexes consisting of an outer layer of phospholipids and protein coat, and an inner core of triglycerides, so basically fats, cholesterol and other lipids. Two major types of lipoprotein are low-density lipoproteins known as LDLs and high-density lipoproteins known as HDLs. So, just to summarize that again, we've got phospholipids in a protein coat around the outer part of the lipoprotein, and in the center we have cholesterol, triglycerides, and other lipids. The whole structure is just a few nanometers in size, so very small. These are tiny, tiny particles, and they're transporting fat around the body, basically. So, the two types of lipoprotein. We have the low-density lipoproteins, LDLs. They transport cholesterol to the tissues of the body, to the organs, to the tissues of the body. Then we have high-density lipoproteins, HDLs. These remove cholesterol from the tissues of the body and return it to the liver. So LDLs are taking the fat to the tissues where it can actually do harm and cause disease. And the high-density lipoproteins, the HDLs, are removing cholesterol from the tissues, returning it to the liver where it can be processed safely. So HDLs have less lipid than LDLs. That's one thing that should be noted right away. So how does cholesterol relate to coronary heart disease? If there's a tear in the endothelial lining of coronary arteries, the LDLs enter the inner layer of the arteries, as I mentioned earlier. The cholesterol and fat that they carry are oxidized and build up. This forms an atherosclerosis plaque. This enlarges the wall of the artery, giving the arteries a rough lining. Parts of the lining of the artery becomes damaged. Gradually over time, cells divide in the arteriole and there's build-up of lipids. We've gone through this. You get eventually maybe a heart attack known as a myocardial infarction. But even at a minor level, you can have things like angina. So HDLs, the high-density lipoproteins, are commonly known as good fat. They appear to protect against coronary heart disease by removing cholesterol from the tissues, including the tissues in the walls of the blood vessels. So HDL's good, LDL's bad. But it's all about proportions. Health professionals are now less concerned about the quantity of cholesterol in the body. The focus is now on the proportions of HDLs and LDLs. The more HDLs, the less chance of heart disease. So diets rich in saturated fats, so fats, animal fats basically, tend to increase the cholesterol concentration of the blood due to a high LDL concentration. Polyunsaturated fats in foods, e.g. fish oils, omega-3, and things such as olive oil and other plant oils help protect against heart disease and lower the concentration of cholesterol in the blood. So antioxidants also play a role. So, for example, vitamin C and vitamin E. Antioxidants are protective and reduce the risk of developing coronary heart disease. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, you've got to oxidize these fats for them to have a harmful effect in the tissues. Antioxidants help prevent that oxidation. So antioxidants such as vitamin C and E are good in a roundabout sort of way. Fresh fruits and vegetables are rich sources of these vitamins. High blood cholesterol levels. So LDLs generally transport cholesterol from the liver to the body tissues, depositing it on the walls of the blood vessels. In high levels, this contributes to atherosclerosis, which is going to build up of the fat within the arteries. Eating a diet high in saturated fat is the biggest cause of elevated LDL cholesterol levels. LDL cholesterol levels can be reduced by regular exercise, eating plenty of fibre, and a diet rich in polyunsaturated fats. HDLs generally transport cholesterol away from the tissues to the liver, where the cholesterol is metabolized, broken down, made safe, as it were. High levels of HDL cholesterol are linked to reduced risk of coronary heart disease. When it comes to smoking, smoking tobacco is a major cause of coronary heart disease, and smokers are at a higher risk of developing various other conditions, including lung cancer also, not to mention emphysema. Nasty way to go, emphysema. The lungs basically fail slowly over time and you suffocate. Not a good way to go. Smoking increases the risk of coronary heart disease in several ways. It damages and weakens the endothelial lining of blood vessels. It increases clotting and the development of atheromas. It lowers high-density lipoprotein cholesterol and raises LDL cholesterol levels. Nicotine increases blood pressure also and heart rate and constricts blood vessels. This is one of the reasons why vaping isn't all good, because one thing vaping still contains, still provides is nicotine, and it's the nicotine that's increasing blood pressure. So best thing to do is to give up altogether. Although I think vaping probably is safer than tobacco smoke. Although, once again, disclaimer, the evidence is still out there. Carbon monoxide, which is present in tobacco, reduces the amount of oxygen that blood can carry also, which has another negative effect on the body. So coronary heart disease leads to heart attack, or can lead to heart attack, myocardial infarction it is known as. A blood clot in the coronary artery cuts off the blood supply to an area of the heart muscle, and that particular region of the heart then can die. Cardiac arrest, so severe heart attack can result from coronary heart disease. The heart basically stops. Angina, so pain when exercising, that's a more minor symptom, but it can still be, quite debilitating in many ways. You can also get thrombosis, the development of a blood clot, which is bad. Blood clots can damage organs, damage tissues, and blood clots can come loose, resulting in strokes and heart attacks also. So the effects of coronary heart disease, a heart attack first. The most dangerous symptom or result of coronary heart disease is a heart attack known as a myocardial infarction, an MI. An MI occurs when the blood supply to parts of the heart muscle, the myocardium, is interrupted. This causes oxygen deprivation and subsequent tissue damage. The most common symptom is chest pain, but shortness of breath, excessive sweating, nausea and weakness may also be present. Loss of consciousness and death can occur. Angina. Less severe symptom of coronary heart disease is angina pectoris. This is a tight, gripping chest pain or ache similar to indigestion, which commonly occurs during physical activity. The narrowing of the coronary arteries results in inadequate blood and oxygen supply, forcing the heart to respire anaerobically and causing a buildup of lactic acid. The pain normally subsides with rest once the demand on the heart has dropped and it can respire aerobically, so it can go back to normal. Gender, age, and coronary heart disease and stroke. So below the age of about 75, men have a higher risk of coronary heart disease than women. One reason is that the female hormone estrogen tends to raise HDL cholesterol levels, which has a protective effect. So lucky women. But as you get older, this sort of changes a little bit, and the levels of coronary heart disease start to equalize between men and women. By the way, just being a woman does not mean you can get away with eating lots of nasty fatty food. Your estrogen may have a protective effect, but that protective effect only gets you so far, let's just say. Gets you only so far. Okay, so when it comes to strokes, the risk of stroke is roughly the same between men and women up to the age of about 75. After this age, more women die from stroke than men. So being female does reduce your likelihood of the heart attack, but not necessarily the strokes. And either way is a bad way to go. Bad way to go. In fact, given the choice, I think I'd pick the heart attack rather than the stroke. Okay, so moving on. Actually, I think at this point it might be worth just summarizing where we are. So, when it comes to nutrition, you need carbohydrates, you need fat, you need proteins, you need vitamins, you need minerals. An excess of particularly fats and carbohydrates can cause coronary heart disease, amongst other conditions. I've been focusing on coronary heart disease because it's the big killer, together with hypertension in developed countries. But there's all sorts of other conditions which can result from poor nutrition or inadequate nutrition, either too little or too much of particular fats and sugars is a bad thing. I want to kind of conclude this particular podcast by talking about the importance of balancing your intake of fat and sugar in a diet. Now, for years and years, it was thought by many scientists and many medical doctors that fat was bad. Fat was just bad. If you got fat, it was because you ate too much fat. And these cardiologists and these scientists told this to the food industry. And the food industry did respond. They responded. They tried to lower the amount of fat in many of their dishes, and a whole health food industry burgeoned. And this health food industry created lots of microwave meals and pre-cooked dishes that were low in fat. And the idea being that if you went on these particular diets, you would reduce your fat intake, you would lower your chances of getting coronary heart disease, you would lose weight, you would be healthier. Sounds plausible. But unfortunately, that didn't take into account one simple fact. Fat isn't actually bad. It really isn't. If you go back to Paleolithic times, we ate a lot of fat. In fact, we didn't eat much carbohydrate. Fat levels were much higher in our diet. Carbohydrate levels were much lower. We were eating animals. We were getting fat. We weren't getting so much carbohydrate. Farming is a recent activity. For most of our history, we didn't farm. So we didn't have easy access to grains, to rice, to potatoes, etc., etc. So as a result, we weren't really taking in a lot of carbohydrate. And as a result of that, our bodies have actually evolved to cope with fat reasonably well. Carbohydrate is a thing we have a problem with. When you eat carbohydrates, your body responds by producing insulin. The beta cells of your pancreas make insulin. And the insulin basically gets that sugar, that's a breakdown product of the carbohydrates, out of your bloodstream. It either gets the sugar into the cells, where it can be used for energy, or the sugar is stored as glycogen in your muscles and your liver until it's needed. That's what happens with sugar. So you eat carbohydrate, you produce insulin, you break down the sugar, then it's dealt with. However, if you eat too much carbohydrate, you produce too much insulin, and your cells can become insensitive to this insulin. Type 2 diabetes, which causes all sorts of negative effects on the health. Now, that's not the whole story. Fat is important. So if you eat fat on its own, fat can be used as an energy source, and yes, it can be stored. But if you eat fat with carbohydrate, the situation is much worse, because fat does not trigger the production of insulin. It doesn't trigger it. Carbohydrates triggers the production of insulin. Now, in your body, you have a number of cells known as adipose cells. They are fat cells. Imagine them as hollow, empty sacs. That's what these cells are. And their job is to fill with fat. They fill with fat and store it. That's what these adipose cells do. Now, to actually absorb that fat and fill up, they basically need insulin. Insulin binds to insulin receptors on the surface of these adipose cells, and that allows these adipose cells to take fat in and store it. So if you eat fat on its own, it's harder for your adipose cells to store that fat. If, however, you eat fat with carbohydrate, the carbohydrate will trigger the production of insulin, which will then sensitize these fat cells to taking up that fat, which can lead to obesity. So therefore, fat with carbohydrate is bad. Carbohydrate on its own, it's bad because basically you can become insensitive to insulin. But fat with sugar is the worst thing. Cheesecake, not good. If you have fat with sugar, you basically increase your likelihood of both diabetes and obesity. Fat on its own, not so bad. Carbohydrate on its own, bad. Fat and carbohydrate, the worst. And unfortunately, a lot of these low-fat meals or low-fat diets that people go on to try and lose weight, they remove the fat from a meal, but the carbohydrate is still there. And in some cases, there's even more carbohydrates. And if there's more carbohydrate, then that's going to sensitize the fat cells to take in the fat that is in that meal, even better, and increase your likelihood of diabetes, as well as obesity. Plus, you need fat. You do need it in your diet. So really, if you want to lose weight, then yes, don't eat too much, and yes, exercise, but also don't just rely on cutting fat out of your diet. What you need to do is reduce the carbohydrate in your diet, not necessarily reduce the fat. Have the right kind of fat though. If you've got a plate of food and there's a proportion of fat in that meal, that's not a bad thing, especially if that fat is unsaturated fat. If it's the right kind of fat, if it's things like olive oil, if it's things like fish oil, fish fat, it's not so bad. Just keep away from the saturated fat and reduce the amount of carbohydrate in your dish. So have fat, the right kind of fat, have protein, although we don't need anywhere near as much protein as we tend to have in modern developed world diets. We don't need that much protein in our diet. We don't need a big steak. We just need a small amount of protein to live. Have your greens. You need your fiber, remember. You need the fiber to create all that good bacteria and to help with digestive transit, really. So a typical healthy plate of food should have a lot of fiber, should have a relatively small amount of carbohydrates so we don't stimulate insulin production at too high a rate, and the right kind of carbohydrates too, by the way, ones that digest slowly, the complex carbohydrates. And we should have some fat there, the right kind of fat, the kind of fat that takes away the cholesterol and the other baddies from our tissues and deposits them to the liver. Okay, so I will conclude now. So there's a lot more to talk about on diet and nutrition. This particular podcast, we'll call that the first edition. The first edition of Nutrition and Diet. I will release a few more podcasts that relate to nutrition and diet, quite a few, not focusing on coronary heart disease in those, focusing on other consequences of a poor diet and what we can do about them. So things such as how diet can affect levels of cancer, Alzheimer's disease and other conditions too. One thing I would recommend is to actually listen to another one of my podcasts, the one on sulforaphane. Sulforaphane is a dietary supplement which really does help bring down inflammation in the body. And as I mentioned earlier, inflammation is bad, causes all sorts of conditions. So I do recommend that particular podcast. It's quite a short one. So a lot of information, but quick to get through, and you'll get some good pointers in improving your health and longevity from that particular podcast. Okay, so that's all for now. I look forward to chatting with you guys again in the next Science on the Edge podcast or the next Snack Size. Have a great day. Thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did find the episode interesting and would like to know a little bit more, there are a number of ways you can do that. First of all, you could follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Dr. Mark Darcy. That's just all lowercase, DRMARKDARCY. You can drop me an email. The address is info@scienceontheedge.com, or you could visit the website scienceontheedge.com. The website is still under development, but new content is appearing all the time. Also, if you would like to support Science on the Edge and keep these podcasts under production, then you can make a small donation by visiting scienceontheedge.com and clicking on the donate button. Thank you very much and hope to see you again soon.